It's not every day that the past knocks on your door with such force that the present nearly collapses. It was an ordinary Tuesday, hot and stifling, the kind where no one expects anything out of the ordinary. Victoria Montenegro woke up early, as usual, drowning in emails, calls and meetings. Since her father's death, she had been more in control of the empire he left behind than ever, and yet she felt more lost than she'd ever admit. The pain of her missing daughter hadn't faded with time. It had only changed shape. It had become a constant silent void, one she'd learned to mask with expensive wine and sleepless nights. That morning, she had no idea something was about to shatter the cold logic of her days. And it all began with some idle channel surfing on the living room TV while she drank her coffee. It was during a local news segment, a simple feature on hard-working young people, that Victoria froze. Among the faces shown was a waitress with expressive eyes, familiar features, and a necklace that made her drop her cup. A delicate golden butterfly, identical to the one she'd placed around her daughter's neck before letting her go. It couldn't be a coincidence. Victoria stood up so fast she forgot her shoes. Her heart pounded in a strange way, as if reliving the minutes before childbirth. It wasn't just the necklace. It was the way the girl moved, her shy smile, the slight arch of her eyebrow. It was like looking into a mirror of what might have been. She didn't know the girl's name or the exact restaurant, but she knew she had to find her, and she would do it that very day. Victoria didn't hesitate. She called her driver, and within half an hour, she was with her security team trying to track down the restaurant from the news report. She didn't tell anyone at the company, didn't explain her sudden absence. She just left. It was as if something greater was pulling her toward that place. She knew it might seem like madness, a hallucination born of years of frustration. But this wasn't just intuition. The butterfly necklace wasn't an ordinary accessory. It had a tiny, almost imperceptible engraving, her grandmother's initials. That detail was there, gleaming, hanging around that waitress's neck like a scar shining in the sun. And even without knowing the girl's name, the news had shown the restaurant's uniform and a sign in the background. It was enough. 2 hours later, Victoria was sitting in the restaurant, tucked into a strategic corner, her hair half hidden under a scarf and oversized sunglasses that looked out of place. She tried to seem casual, but the tightness in her chest betrayed the urgency of the moment. Luciana appeared out of nowhere, carrying a tray with the tired expression of someone who'd lived too much before turning 25. When she smiled at a customer at the next table, Victoria felt the ground vanish beneath her. It was that smile, the same one she saw in the mirror, in the few photos from when she still had hope for the future. It was like staring at a fragmented version of herself, but it wasn't just emotion. It was confusion, fear, guilt. Victoria could barely breathe as she watched from afar, every movement feeling like a reckoning with fate. She didn't know how to approach her, or if she even should, but the butterfly on the necklace swayed with each of the waitress's steps, like a sign screaming now or never. And that's when Victoria stood up, legs trembling, and decided to call her over. Victoria hadn't rehearsed what to say, and maybe that was for the best. When Luciana turned to serve her, their eyes met, and the world seemed to shrink around them. For a second, neither spoke. Victoria just pointed timidly at the necklace, like a child, and asked, her voice catching, "Where did you get that?" Luciana, used to strange questions from customers, frowned at her tone. The discomfort was visible on her face. She clutched the pendant as if protecting something precious, and answered, coldly, "It's always been mine. It's all my birth mother left me." Victoria's stomach twisted. It wasn't just the necklace. It was confirmation that everything she'd searched for 2 decades was standing less than a meter away, carrying wounds she didn't know how to heal. The pain in Luciana's eyes wasn't curiosity, it was loss. In an impulse she couldn't control, Victoria whispered, "I'm your mother." The words came out more like a confession than a revelation. Luciana recoiled as if slapped. "What?" was all she managed to say. The next table fell silent. An eerie quiet settled over the room. Victoria tried to explain, but her voice kept breaking. She spoke of her search, the years of suffering, the letters she'd never sent. Luciana refused to listen. "You abandoned me. I grew up in an orphanage, lost the parents who raised me, and now you show up like some kind of visitor?" She was shaking with rage. The manager approached, alarmed, and Victoria apologized, fighting back. Tears. Luciana turned and ran out the back door, leaving behind the smell of fried food, the clatter of silverware, and a shattered woman sitting alone at the table, the past etched on her face. Victoria didn't leave immediately. She sat there for long minutes, staring at her untouched water glass. The manager, sensing this wasn't her place to interfere, kept her distance. Victoria replayed the scene over and over, wondering if there'd been a better way. Maybe it was too soon. Maybe the impact was inevitable. The truth was, she was still processing it herself. She felt overwhelmed, relief, guilt, fear. The daughter she'd searched for existed, was alive, well, but the rejection had been a punch to the gut. She knew she couldn't force anything, but she also couldn't just walk away. So discreetly, she handed an envelope to a waiter, asking him to give it to Luciana if she returned. Inside were copies of every letter she'd written over the years, ones she'd never had the courage to send. Luciana spent the rest of the afternoon wandering the city, trying to make sense of what had happened. What bothered her most wasn't Victoria's sudden appearance, but the storm of confusion it stirred inside her. She was angry, yes, but she also felt something she refused to admit: recognition. When she caught her reflection in a cafe bathroom mirror, she saw something in her own eyes she'd never noticed before: resemblance. And that unsettled her more than any outburst. She took off the necklace, gripping it tightly as if it held answers. Why now, she thought. Why, after all these years, today like this? She returned to the restaurant at the end of her shift, unsure what she'd do, and was surprised by the envelope. She took it home, tossed it on the couch, paced for hours before mustering the courage to open it. The first letter was dated on Luciana's first birthday. The handwriting was steady, but every sentence was heavy with unspoken pain. Victoria described how the day crushed her, how she still remembered the scent of her baby, how she lit 2 candles, one for her daughter, one for their reunion. Luciana read it all in one breath. By the third letter, she was on the floor, surrounded by papers and her own thoughts. For the first time, she considered that maybe this woman hadn't just walked away, as she'd always believed. Maybe there was more to the story, but she didn't know if she was ready to forgive. It was too much. She remembered every silent birthday, every Mother's Day she'd pretended not to care. Now she couldn't pretend anymore. Almost on impulse, she went searching for answers. She called the only person tied to her adoption she still trusted, the family's old lawyer. He was elderly, hard to reach, but she persisted. When she finally got through, all it took was the name Montenegro for the line to go heavy with silence. He hesitated, dodged, but finally admitted something had been off from the start. Missing documents, erased records, unexplained gaps, and one name kept surfacing as the architect, Armando Salvatierra. Luciana didn't know who he was, but the name burned into her mind, and in a rage-fueled impulse, she decided to go straight to the source. The next day, she'd show up at Montenegro headquarters and stare into the eyes of the man who'd erased her history. Luciana arrived at the Montenegro building in the afternoon, dressed like someone refusing to be intimidated. Dark jeans, a simple shirt, the butterfly necklace. On display, as if saying, "I belong here too." She didn't know what she'd do or how she'd be received, but anger gave her a courage she'd never felt. She asked for Armando Salvatierra. The receptionist, polite but wary, asked her to wait. Luciana noticed the stares. This wasn't a place for someone like her, and everyone knew it. As she waited, Victoria, returning from a meeting, spotted her from across the lobby and froze. Seeing her daughter there, so determined and serious, flooded her with hope and fear. She approached carefully, but before she could speak, Luciana snapped, "I want to talk to the man who stole my past." The confrontation was direct. Armando, seeing her, tried to remain composed, but faltered when he noticed Victoria beside her. Luciana, clutching the letters and armed with the truth, didn't hold back. She laid out everything the lawyer had revealed: the manipulations, the missing files. Victoria, stunned, turned to Armando for denial, but he lowered his gaze. His silence confirmed it all. The woman who'd trusted him for decades now saw clearly what she'd refused to see. He'd been afraid her reputation would suffer, so he'd erased the only part of her life that truly mattered. Without a second thought, Victoria fired him on the spot in front of everyone. Security escorted him out as the building seemed to exhale for the first time. Luciana watched silently, but inside, something shifted. For the first time, she wondered if her mother might have been telling the truth. Victoria asked Luciana to come upstairs. She didn't push, just said she'd be there if Luciana wanted to talk. And for the first time, Luciana agreed. They rode the elevator in silence. From the top floor, the city looked small, almost insignificant compared to the weight of this reunion. Victoria's office was spacious, lined with books and old photos. Luciana noticed a frame face down on the desk and, without asking, turned it over. It was a photo of a baby swaddled in a white blanket, lilac ribbon around it, the same face she'd seen in her own childhood albums. She sat down without a word. Victoria sat across from her, and for the first time, she didn't look like the powerful CEO the world knew. She looked fragile, almost transparent. She didn't justify herself, just handed Luciana one last letter written the night before, after their encounter at the restaurant. "If you never want to see me again, you'll understand. But I needed to look you in the eyes." Luciana read it, and for the first time she cried. Not the angry, frustrated tears she'd carried for years, but something messier, relief and pain tangled together. The letter spoke of the butterfly, how Victoria's grandmother used to say that when someone we love is gone, they return in another form. That love never dies, it just changes shape. Victoria wrote that even if Luciana never forgave her, just knowing she was alive was enough to keep breathing. Luciana stayed quiet after finishing. She stood, looked out the window one last time, and said, her voice thick, "I don't know what happens next, but maybe I want to know more." Victoria nodded, saying nothing. Sometimes, silence is the only language between two people learning to recognize each other. When Luciana left the office, the building felt different. Not because the lighting had changed or the furniture moved, but because for the first time, she didn't feel like an intruder. The employees avoided eye contact, but the respect in the air was palpable. Victoria stayed seated a while longer, staring at the empty chair where Luciana had been. For the first time in decades, she was uncertain, and it was liberating. The rage at Armando still burned, but it was small compared to the vulnerability her daughter's presence had awakened. Victoria knew there was no easy path forward. Luciana wouldn't forget the lost years, the silence, the pain. But something had cracked open, a sliver of possibility, and she'd cling to it with everything she had. Luciana walked the streets like someone returning from war. She wasn't happy nor relieved. It was something else, like she'd finally filled a hole she'd never been able to name. She stopped at a simple cafe, the same one where she'd cried alone before, and this time she ordered food. She couldn't swallow much, but the hunger wasn't physical. It was symbolic, as if her body needed to register that she now existed somewhere else in the world. She took out her phone and, after a while, typed a short message. "Read everything. Yesterday's letter too, thank you." She sent it to the number Victoria had left in the envelope. Just 3 words and a thank you, but they meant everything. Victoria got the message in the car on her way home and read it over and over, unable to hold back tears. It was the first spontaneous gesture from her daughter, and for someone who'd waited 22 years, 3 words were more than enough. That same night, Luciana went home and, before bed, took off the butterfly necklace for the first time in years, not out of rejection, but care. She placed it in a velvet box where she kept few precious things. For the first time, the necklace wasn't just a symbol of abandonment. It was something more complex, still painful, but now also hopeful. She studied the pendant in the dim lamplight. She thought of the grandmother she'd never met, of Victoria at 18, being torn from her child like a limb ripped away. She still didn't know if she could call that woman-mother. The word carried a weight no letter could erase, but the disdain was gone. There was something there, a crack of affection maybe. And for someone like Luciana, that was enough to want to see what came next. Victoria, across the city, lit 2 candles as she did every year. But that night she lit a third, small, simple, but necessary. One for the daughter she'd birthed, one for the reunion she'd dreamed of, and this last one for the future she didn't yet know how to build. She left them burning on the mantle, a private ritual. She was alone, and that was better. She didn't want forced smiles or symbolic celebrations. She just wanted to feel, and she did. The void was still there, of course, but its edges were softer now. For the first time, rebuilding was possible. It wouldn't be like before. 22 years of distance couldn't be undone with a hug. But it wasn't too late. She knew her daughter carried deep scars, some from choices she herself had made, even if coerced. But now, for the first time, silence wasn't calling the shots. The next morning, Luciana woke with heavy eyes but a strangely light head. No nightmares, no usual anxiety of feeling like something was missing. There were still questions, of course, and resentment. But for some reason, the air felt less dense. Checking her phone, she saw Victoria had replied with a single image, a candle burning between 2 others, captioned, "For you, for us, for what might still be." Luciana stared at it for a long moment. She thought about responding, but decided to save the photo instead. It wasn't time for words, it was time to process. To understand what all of this meant, without the pressure of fixing everything at once. For the first time, she understood that reconciliation isn't an act, it's a process, and the first step, however small, had been taken. Meanwhile, Victoria cancelled all her meetings for the day. She left without telling anyone and drove to a small orphanage on the outskirts of the city, the same one that years ago had appeared in reports she'd never been able to access. She carried a box of old toys, children's books, and a generous donation. But what she really wanted was to see the place where her daughter had spent part of her childhood. She introduced herself only as an old friend of the house and asked to walk the grounds. The children played, oblivious to her presence. Victoria sat on a bench under a tree and watched. Within those plain walls, a life had been built, away from her but still full of dignity. As much as it hurt, there was something beautiful in the strength Luciana had forged there. Victoria didn't know how time could be mended, but on that bench, with children's laughter in the background, she promised herself she'd do whatever it took to earn even the smallest space in her daughter's life. That night, as the day threatened to end quietly, Luciana took out the box where she'd stored the butterfly necklace. She opened it slowly, as if afraid the gesture might bring back everything she'd felt. She ran her fingers over the pendant and for the first time felt at peace with it. It wasn't just a symbol of what was missing, it was also a reminder of what had been found. She put the necklace back on, not as a final act of forgiveness, but as a way to remind herself that life is made of beginnings and second chances. She called Victoria. The voice on the other end took a shaky moment to answer. "Hi, Mom." That was all she said. On the other end, silence broke only with a stifled sob. Neither said another word, and it was enough. The next day, Victoria placed the melted candle in a wooden box alongside one of the letters Luciana had read. She closed it carefully and wrote on the lid, "First day of the rest of our story." She didn't know if it would ever mean anything to her daughter, but she needed to keep it, like a treasured memory. At the office, Armando's firing had sparked whispers and sideways glances. But Victoria didn't care. For the first time, she owed nothing to anyone except the daughter she'd found. Life went on, as it always does, but with something different in the air. A kind of silence that doesn't unsettle, but comforts. The butterfly necklace stayed around Luciana's neck, as if it had finally found its place. And even if no one could explain exactly how it all happened, the fact remained. On that single day, fate bent for two weary hearts, and allowed a story once interrupted to begin again.